So we can, I think, just begin with some of the intros and all that stuff just to get started. Thank you for those of you who are here now, and hopefully we'll get a few more people too, but if not, then it'll be a nice cozy conversation. What I want to do just to start off with, I'm going to share my screen and just start off with some introductions. Krrish, can I ask you to introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, so myself, Krrish, and I'm working at HFI as a group lead. I work on various projects, right, from strategy to design to UIS project. And I'm basically a finance specialist. So I work in the finance domain, including banking, insurance, asset management, and those kind of things. And I'm also a CUA course trainer. So, and I'm sure some of you have already gone through my LinkedIn profile. I get that a lot when I teach. So yeah, feel free to do that. And I have about 16 plus years of industry experience, ranging from development to UX to design and consulting as well. So yeah, and feel free to ask any questions that you may have regarding Agile, UX, design, anything.
Awesome. And yeah, Krrish will be speaking a little bit later on about his experience doing UX with Agile, and I'm looking forward to that. A little bit about me. I've had 9 years at HFI. Before that, I did my doctoral work, my dissertation work on UX and digital games. So I bring some of that kind of perspective to the work I do. And so my job title is Executive User Experience Strategist. And so I do, like Krrish, I do training. I teach. I'm one of the teachers for now 7 of our courses at HFI. I created one of them. I'm involved in scoping what we need for different kinds of projects, and especially various kinds of consulting, but especially strategy and design kinds of consulting. The kinds of strategy work, not only strategy for designs themselves, but also strategies for companies. Within the last maybe 3 or 4 years, there's been a lot of demand for work helping companies to build their own UX maturity. And so I bring that perspective. If you don't know, HFI has a certain focus on the maturity of UX at companies. And so that's one of the big focuses for me. Oh, and I have some pictures from some of my hobbies here. And so you see I'm a performer. I do magic. And so you see me there in that image performing. This is me at Coney Island performing there. That was, I think, last month. I perform there monthly now. I also do weightlifting, and I do, and I have an adorable daughter, although your video thing may be obscuring it. We try to set up these slides so it's not, but by the way, if something is obscured, you can move that window by just dragging and dropping if you want to be able to see anything there. But I think the rest of these slides shouldn't have anything covered. And it's okay if you don't see my adorable daughter's smiling face. Anyway, so that's a bit about me. A quick note before we get started here. The way that we're going to be doing this is we encourage interaction and questions and all of that. We're going to save the questions for the end just because they may get answered along the way, and it's easier that way. But we'll start off with, I'll talk a little and Krrish will talk a little, and then we'll do a bunch of Q&A. The questions, the way that we like to do that, there are some different ways of trying to ask questions, but what we wanted to use is this hand raising function, because what we're able to do is to bring you guys in as it changes you to like a panelist in the terminology of the interface. But the idea is that we can bring you in so you can speak. You can share video also. We invite you to do that, but you're able to then ask your question real time and clarify it and let us know what the question is. To do that, you need to let us know you have a question. And so there's this function where you can do what is not literally raising your hand physically in the real world, but instead raising your hand in the interface. And so the way you do that, you see highlighted in orange at the bottom. You should see this on your screen, right? So this is a screen cap of what your screen looks like. At the bottom, you should have a little thing that says participants. If you click on that, then this panel will open up on the right. And under that, in this area at the bottom, it's not on this screen, but in this area at the bottom, it'll say raise hand. And if you click the button to raise hand, then that'll put you at the top. Well, that'll put you next in the queue. And so we'll see the order in which people have their hands raised. If you already have a question, feel free to raise your hand now and you'll be front of the queue. It's fine. And so we'll go through those in sequence and answer as many questions as we can. So that's something I want to highlight right away, and I may reiterate that at the end, but I just want to let everyone know what to expect with that so you're not frantically typing out questions. Cool. All right. So with that, grab my notepad. With that, I just want to go ahead and kind of dive into this. So I'm going to be speaking about some guidance about how to fit UX with Agile. And I'm speaking from that perspective, as I said, of really having helped companies with building their UX maturity. And so I'm going to be talking about it from that point of view in a way. And three basic pieces. I'm going to start off with a few things about how to think about UX in an Agile context. I'm going to talk about different kinds of problems we get doing UX in an Agile context and the solutions to those problems. And then I'm going to talk about our methodology for doing the targeted Agile framework, that methodology for doing UX in an Agile world. And I should say, we'll give you the top level of detail for that. We're not giving the whole in-depth model of it, but we'll give you a good vision of that and a good idea of what that looks like, and answer questions about it too. So we'll start off with this thing about kind of the way to think about it. And this has some important pieces. I'm assuming you all know what Agile is, that we're kind of taking a big thing and breaking it up into smaller pieces. But the thing that I want to start off by mentioning is that the reason we do that is sometimes confusing for people because you hear a lot of emphasis on making things fast and cheap. And the reality is that that is a misinterpretation of Agile. So Agile was originally created by developers who were working third-party for other organizations. And they would have these great big projects they'd sign up to do, and they'd get scope creep because it's hard to define the limits of the scope when you're in that kind of a world. And so Agile takes the work and breaks it up into smaller pieces so you get less scope creep. The other thing is adaptability. So if you sign up to do a project and it's a year-long thing to do, sometimes you find that you need to change the trajectory of that. And so doing that thing of breaking it up into smaller increments means that you can be more flexible. So that was really the reason why Agile was created. But if you go to the Agile Manifesto, I think it's agilemanifesto.org or something, or .com, I don't think it's .org. If you go there and look, there is nothing there about fast and cheap. You'll hear this from business all the time. It's really a misinterpretation, though. And by the way, part of the reason I mentioned this is that you'll hear this a lot in other contexts that aren't even like development contexts, where they'll take even marketing stuff sometimes and say, can you do that Agile in a way that makes no sense at all? Basically meaning, can you do that without us having to spend the time and money on it? But the reality is that things take some time and money. And actually the reality is that Agile, even in that development world, doesn't always make things faster. Right? Doing things in smaller pieces doesn't mean the overall speed is necessarily faster, and sometimes it's even slower. But that's not the goal, right? It's not about fast and cheap. The other kind of context that I want to emphasize is you probably hear this a lot or feel this a lot, this thing of like, oh, we're going to do Agile right eventually, but for now we're making compromises. And so you may be feeling things that are a result of that. And I want to tell you that that's just normal, right? There are very few companies I talk with where they're doing Agile exactly right, checking all the boxes and doing it by the book. And in some ways, that's because that's some of the premise of Agile. But in some ways, that's just the context. And so versions of this, right, you see, oh, we're doing Agile, but we're skipping a bunch of steps. And so it's fragile. Or we're doing Agile, but we're still half doing Waterfall. So it's Wagile, right? A bunch of these kinds of things. And on one hand, yes, that has implications and challenges. On the other hand, it's just part of the territory, and we're going to have to work within that context. The other thing I want to emphasize about this, though, is that I want to give you kind of start making a division in your mind between two things, because there are a set of things that are challenges because of Agile itself. There are also a lot of challenges that are easy to blame on Agile, but are frankly not really because of Agile. Challenges that are the result of, not of Agile, but of an immature UX maturity kind of a state in the organization, not of the people, but of the way that the organization supports the people. So that's important context. And actually that idea is something I want to take a moment to highlight itself. You hear this sometimes in other contexts, this idea that where you see a problem is not always the cause of that problem. So even in things like body things, I've heard this as, the site of the pain is rarely the source of the pain. You'll get this where, and I've just had this where my ankle is having a problem. And I went to a doctor yesterday who said, actually what's going on is you've got a tightness in your calf that's pulling on this tendon, and that's causing the problem in the ankle. So the site of the pain is rarely the source of the pain. In that same way, if you're having trouble with the way that UX is fitting within Agile, and let me be very concrete about this, right? You get thrown into a project and they're already on sprint 1 or sprint 2, and you're going, oh, let me do what I can to do UX. It's already too late, right? I don't care how good and smart and effective you are. It just doesn't matter if you don't have a bunch of other stuff set up ahead of time. And so what really lets us be effective within Agile is the work that we do outside of and usually in front of Agile. And I'll paint a clearer picture of what that means later. This is one of those, like, you may have questions about this now, but they may be a little bit clarified later on kinds of things. So yeah, this is an important theme that I want to emphasize. Another kind of facet of this is just the distinction between, you hear about lean UX, and I'll talk more about that later too, but yeah, it's good to be agile and lean, and some of that means that we don't overinvest in things like that. But there's another side of that where you can go too far and be starving, right? So I want to emphasize that, yeah, I know 80-20 rule and all of that, but doing 80-20 rule, but maybe if I do like 20% of the 20% or 20% of that, so I'm doing like 0.2, it just doesn't work out, right? There's a point where you're not doing anything. So things like, guerrilla UX and things like that, right? Guerrilla usability testing, I gotta say, it's not recommended. Right, it is too costly, too risky. You get you waste too much time. You get terrible data. It's a bad way to do the work. The traditional usability testing that we talk about, where you're doing, 20 to 60 participants in that kind of range, roughly, depending on the context and how diverse the users are. Sometimes a little less, but on that order, that kind of traditional usability testing, already traditionally, that's called discount usability testing, because of the way that the math works around that. You can ask me more about that if you're interested. But, and this may tick some people off. I may be upsetting some people with this, but I got to tell you, I don't recommend this kind of thing. It's too lean. It's lean to the point of having too large costs and risks as a result. But we'll talk more about how you do fit usability testing into Agile coming up. So some problems and solutions. All right, let me highlight some problems we see a lot of the time. One of the big problems is we do all of these kind of features, doing user stories, and I do them bit by bit, and I make lots of good features, or I make lots of good pages, lots of good pieces of things, but they're badly organized, so no one can find them. And I don't care how good the things are, if you can't find them, they're not there. Right. So are you in this problem? Are you having this challenge? If you are, then the solution to that is that before you get into the Agile cycles, remember that theme, right? Before you get into the Agile cycles, we need to figure out what the user's mental model is and build a navigation that fits with that. So for instance, you think about things like a shoe store, a physical shoe store. You walk in and look around and you expect a certain organization. You expect to see men's shoes separate from women's shoes, separate from children's shoes, and you expect within each of those to see a certain kind of division. If instead, and you'll see that in a website too. So men's shoes, women's shoes, girls' shoes, boys' shoes, right? And then divisions under that. If instead you showed up in a physical store or a website and you saw it was organized by like alphabetical by brand name, and then you chose whether it was men's, women's, or children's, something like that, it would be very confusing, right? It doesn't match with your mental model. And this is a very obvious example of this, just to make it clear, but it's usually not so obvious, and there isn't usually such an easy analogy. And so this takes some work to iron out, to figure out. Normally we do this using user research and all of that. So I'll talk more about that a little bit later on, but I want to also be clear with this, that this is not big design up front. What we're talking about is building an overall structure, an overall plan. I'm not designing everything, but I get that overall navigation structure, and that means that then all of those separate features and functions and pages, as I work on those, fits within that. So it's not doing the whole big design up front, it's just building a blueprint for it. And the reason that matters, if I don't have that, then what I'm doing is, it's like if as an analogy thing, right? I build a little hut, I build a little tiny house. Okay, and then I can build another little tiny house. It's like another feature, right? And what happens is then I'm just building a series of little houses, and they don't go together in any coherent way. If instead I had a blueprint for a castle, I don't build the whole castle, but I have a blueprint. So I know everything's going to go, where it's going to be located on the ground, and what parts of the castle are going to do what. I don't have to build the whole castle all at once. I can build one turret. I can build one part of the castle. And then once I'm done with that, the next part of it is going to connect and work with it and have its own separate purpose, and it's all going to fit and flow in an effective way. And so this idea is really core. This is that kind of architectural phase, and this has to happen before we get to sprint zero. I need to have that blueprint down in order to help me out with the planning that we normally do in sprint zero of building the MVP or however you're planning that out. I want to prioritize around this blueprint. This lets us do user-centered design. Otherwise, I'm functionally not doing user-centered design, right? Another kind of challenge we see a lot of the time is we don't know enough about our users in Agile. We don't get enough contact with users. Often this is under that circumstance of too much kind of diving in too fast and not enough time and all of that. And one of the things that I want to caution about is, user stories. User stories are great and they're important. They're a way of keeping track of features and functions. I care about that. But, and I want to be clear, they often do have a lot of detail about those kinds of features and functions for those depth and details about that. But from the user's perspective, about deeply understanding the user and the user's context, a user story is not that, right? Unless you have drastically changed what user story means in most contexts, usually a user story doesn't have that depth. In the UX area. It's not the job of a user story. And so, yes, they're important, but we also need to have that user-centered design side of that, where we have a clear vision of who those users are. And that's much more of their context, right? What are their mental models, like I talked about before, things about who they are demographically and all of that, where they are, what they're doing, what their task flows are, this whole series of things. We often kind of build an ecosystem model, and it's just way more than a user story is even designed to do. And so this is something that we need to do. And it's something that, again, we need to be doing before we get into those agile cycles. It's too late to build a serious model of who the user is by the time I'm already doing sprints. Another of these challenges, right? I am building something that no one wants. I build so this is a banana slicer. Yeah, we could just use a knife for that, right? So building, it could be a beautiful, wonderful, effective banana slicer, but no one wants it. And so this is that problem of like we talked about with the features and functions, right? Even earlier on with that, what stuff am I designing in the first place? And so the short story about this is that we really believe this should be done in a user-centered kind of way. When HFI does this, our innovation work begins with two types of research, right? We do one type of research called PET interviews to understand people's deep emotional needs. We do another kind of research we call ecosystem research, which is kind of a more sophisticated version of contextual inquiry, right? Where we understand the breadth of users' contexts. And by really understanding people's contexts and the depth of their emotions, then we can do really powerful innovation. And now those designs that we're doing are things people actually want, solve problems for them, have value. And part of that, of course, also that needs to fit with our business needs and our development capabilities. But this is this whole kind of innovation process we use. And whatever innovation process you use, it should be user-driven. Design thinking is another version of this kind of thing, by the way. I prefer ours, but I'm biased. Design thinking is good too. I don't have anything against it, really. Another of these challenges is that we'll see this kind of a mismatched mess. I create all these different designs, but they look different. They behave different. They have different kinds of looks and feels. And if you're in that situation, it's actually not that complicated to deal with. But again, a thing I have to do ahead of time, which is templates. So when I'm doing design, this is a physical stencil in the real world to get the idea across. It's not actually a literal stencil I'm talking about, right? I'm talking about more like screen designs. And you can do it with full screen templates. You can do it with more like a pattern library of separate parts of screens. But the point is that when I'm doing my design, I don't want to be starting from scratch every single design, not only because it's more inefficient to do that, not only because it's a waste of time to start from scratch, but also because it means that I get something that's very inconsistent across those different experiences. And so templates let us be more consistent. But again, it's not something that we do like, oh, I've started in sprint 1 or 2, and I'm going to also make templates as I go. We need to have that done ahead of time. And ideally, I should have templates done in a way that's really organization-wide. so that I can use that again and again across my different projects. And so that's an investment that we need to do out in front of things. I should also just side note mention that vast majority of companies think about templates at least a little bit. Vast majority of companies also drastically underestimate what it takes to make good templates in a number of ways. So that's just a separate conversation. If you guys have questions about it, feel free, but wanted to warn about that. And another of these issues is the validation with users. We need to see what's going on with users, and I see a surprising number of organizations where we go, hey, I'm doing this agile cycle stuff, and I've got UX like building designs, but nothing ever gets checked with users. And so the solution to this is now, I think, fairly well established, but the solution is doing just 1 day usability tests for each sprint. And you see different recommendations for this. I've seen some recommendations that are like a half a day. I usually recommend 1 day. If you have much longer sprints, you might be able to get away with like a 2-day usability test. Usually you can fit like 4 or 5 usability tests in a day, sometimes up to 6, it depends. But you see an order of magnitude, right? If I'm doing a half a day usability test, that's like 3 participants. I'd like to get at least 5. And I also want to emphasize that doesn't mean that each design is only seen by those 5 or so users, right? What that means is over many sprints, we aggregate a larger number of users. So what'll happen, and I'll talk more about some of the details of how we do this shortly, but what'll happen is if I've got a 5-day test each sprint, then the design gets seen by users in a very rough form in the first sprint. In the next sprint, I might have it seen in a more refined form, right? And I might revisit it a little bit even once it's gotten to the developers. That's assuming a sprint ahead model, right? Whatever model you're using though, that design is going to be seen over many iterations, and so then I can tweak it as I go, which is one of the nice things about that. But also it means that I can kind of safeguard against having too many outliers. If I have 5-person usability test, I might have 3 outliers. I might even have 4. I might have people who are unusual, and then I can correct that a little bit over iterations. Another challenge, and this is, I think, a very common one, where we see lots and lots of problems in UX, and we make plans, hey, we should fix this, we should fix that. You might come up with a log of 50 or 100 UX problems, and it all kind of gets blown off. I'm sure you've heard this kind of a phrase of, oh yeah, next release, we'll do that in the next release, which is a way of telling you never. And so if you're in that position, then I had a recommendation. This is kind of a tactical ish kind of a recommendation, but I think it's useful, which is basically start leveraging this concept of debt. And so if your organization is, and I should say, this only applies if your organization cares about debt. But if your organization is tracking debt, like technical debt, then 2 ways you can do it. So you can make it so that UX is kind of a separate flag or tag as a type of debt that gets added to the backlog within the technical debt log, or the other thing is you can make a separate UX debt log. And either way, the point is that then you're keeping track of all of those things that get put off. And then you can go back to that. And normally in Agile, we'll have various cycles of basically going and paying off debt, going and taking care of things that have been put off. And in those times, you can say, hey, let's make sure we address some of these higher priority UX debt items. And so that's a useful thing to help with that problem a little bit. And another of these challenges that we see, and again, this is, I think, one that comes up a lot, is just this issue of timelines of, hey, we need to do this UX work, and oh, there's no time for that. Oh, we can't do that. Oh, no time for that, right? Even thrown into the midst of doing, I've started sprint 1 or something. Again, don't recommend that if you have to. I know it happens. But when that happens, right, okay, so let me at least do usability testing each sprint. Oh, no, there's no time for that. There's only time for the development. What do you want me to do then as UX? I guess I'm going to look at the screens and kind of, I know based on basic best practices, I can make some basic recommendations, but they're not going to be very accurate or effective. And the solution to that is succinctly put is plan, right? So we need to plan that time for UX. And I want to be clear that we don't do this because I want to waste time. This is an important thing that's a general principle we have to keep in mind, right? We don't do UX because it's like fun and I like wasting time. We do UX because it saves money, it makes an impact. And so all those ROI things, we talk about this in our CUA classes more, but when you have better usability, you have better conversion and retention. Those kinds of things are fairly obvious if you're doing something customer facing. If I'm doing something with internal users, then there's less time for them to do training, less calls to the help desk, right? All of those kinds of things. There's also, even from the development side, right? If you're talking with a group that's really focused on development, or if any of you on the call are really development focused, how much time the developers waste redoing stuff, right? Totally starting anew on something that they went through the trouble of developing before. They don't like that either, right? I mean, I guess it pays their paycheck or whatever to spend that extra time, but they don't want to have to redevelop stuff. There's research that says, I think it's the IEEE says that fixes that you make after release cost 100 times what they cost to make them before release. When we talk about doing this UX work, it's not to waste time. It's because it's the faster, cheaper, better way to work, right? And yeah, lots of companies try to skip that, and then sometimes the gamble pays off, right? Because it's a risk, but a lot of the time it doesn't. And that's why the world is full of all this surprisingly unusable design. And sometimes it does work out, but man, it's a risk. And so the way that you do that planning, though, is not just a matter of, hey, we're in sprint 0. I'll plan to do UX in the sprints. It's actually out in front of that too. It's when I'm building when I'm designing my overall plan for how I do all of my work. Right? What goes on in my discovery phase? What goes on in my sprints and all of that at a more kind of high level when I'm planning that system development lifecycle, right? SDLC, system development lifecycle. When I'm doing all of that planning, then I need to build UX into that at that level. It needs to be a method I need to have detailed UX methods that are built in to the larger plan. Otherwise, of course, there's no time to do UX, right? It doesn't happen by magic and good intentions. All right, so that's some problems and solutions stuff. And lastly, I want to wrap up by just sharing the method overall. And I want to note a few context things, right? So one context thing important to notice is UX maturity. This is my favorite slide about UX maturity because you see a bunch of the kind of capabilities, elements that we talk about. And what this slide actually is it shows each of the levels of UX maturity as we see them. We actually certify companies for UX maturity. And so you see that that's kind of what that's related to. Gives you a sense of the order in which we build these. But my point with this is that we need to have a lot of this stuff in place if we want to do effective UX work in Agile. For me to be, all this stuff that's here, for me to not have methods I'm following means I don't have the time, just like I just finished talking about, right? I talked about templates before, that's user interface standards. If I don't have that, I'm super inefficient. I have inconsistent screens. So a bunch of this stuff that I've covered, right? A place to do usability testing, adequate education for all the folks, enough staff to do all this work. I need to have all this kind of stuff in place. Especially executive championship, especially governance supporting this work so that I don't get ignored. So this is super important context. And again, this is that idea that the site of the pain is rarely the source of the pain, right? A lot of the time the problems we are suffering through in Agile are the cause of something that happened way before we're actually seeing the problem. And this is where that comes. So this is a big deal. The other thing that I want to just take a moment to note is which things are within the world of what we do in UX, which things fit into the Agile system development lifecycle. So, and I want to note, right, Agile system development lifecycle is for developers. It's not a design system development lifecycle. It's not a business system development lifecycle. No one in Agile would say all of business. Let me rephrase. Very few people in Agile would say that all of business needs to happen in 2-week sprints. Right? And we're not developers. So there's a bunch of work that we do within Agile sprints. And in fact, you can see it. So this is the overall set of things that we do in UX. We have a video coming out soon that'll walk through this more. And it's done by timeline. So from outside of any individual design to that discovery / epic phase, the design phase, and ongoing kind of maintenance work. Once you get into sprint 0 and onwards, right, into those cycles, You can't do any of this stuff in the top half of the screen. So I'm overlaying this little line to kind of make this division. All of this stuff, and you see this is half of the kinds of stuff we do, if not more, because capabilities is actually a much larger set of things. But more, arguably more than half of the stuff we do in UX is not stuff that can happen in an agile life cycle. It's stuff that needs to happen out in front or just outside of that life cycle. But this is the stuff that we can do. So detailed design, usability testing, expert review, these are things we can do in an agile kind of life cycle. Maintenances are their own kind of agile sprints and very similar kinds of things, so detailed design, usability testing, and review. But that's a distinction I want to make. Again, context. And one last thing before I show that that methodology slide that kind of gives you the overall vision of it is a distinction I want to make that's not on that slide, which is two different models of doing UX in an agile lifecycle. There's one model which is called sprint ahead, and this is more this is kind of more long-standing, more established, and frankly more recommended. The other second one I'll talk about in a moment. I used to say that was better. I didn't understand as much. I hadn't done as much kind of reading and didn't have as much experience with it. And so now I see. But overall, what we tend to recommend is being at least one sprint ahead. And you see the idea with this. It's not complicated, but the idea is what I'm doing is creating stuff in one sprint and then handing that off so the developers can work on that in the next sprint. And while they're working on that, I'm working on what the developers will work on in their next sprint. So I'm always one sprint ahead. Pretty simple idea. So you can do our work in this kind of sprint ahead model, or you can do what's in the Lean UX book, which is what I usually call the concurrent model, where you are not a sprint ahead. And I want to be clear, this is usually bad. So what this is where when the designers are doing the design work, the developers are sitting with them the entire time. And then when the developers do the development work, the UX folks are sitting with them the entire time. And usability testing, the entire sequence of usability testing, they only do a half day, but they're doing a 1 week sprint. But they're saying, hey, you should have that, the developers sit in with that the whole time. And they actually, well, so some other things I'll talk about this, but I'll say that overall thing is viable, but you need a few things. The biggest thing I'll emphasize is actually this middle point, right? So development is as cheap and easy as prototyping, because the biggest downside of this concurrent model is there's no prototyping. I'm not building a prototype and testing that. And so if it's incredibly easy to change that, no big deal, but that is incredibly rare. Usually it's going to be way cheaper and faster. I'm less invested, all of those things, if I'm doing some wireframing and testing that first. So that's part of why I want that sprint ahead model. But if that's super easy, then that helps. Also, if I have developers who are super familiar with UX and UX people who are really familiar with development and all of that, right, then that'll make that a little bit more useful, and you need a co-located team. If you have all of those things, then this kind of Lean UX model is maybe viable of doing the concurrent work. Quick note about this overall, big caution about this book in general. It's full of horrifyingly bad advice. They legitimately, sorry, I don't mean to bash the guy and all, but you know, he's coming from this kind of startup background and stuff, and he recommends stuff like having developers run and facilitate usability tests, which is horrifying, especially if they have no training in that, which he doesn't recommend. He doesn't say give them special training. He just says, like, have them run usability tests, which is just real bad. He also says things like, you know, the thing I said before about templates. He suggests that you can do that he legitimately says in a few weeks or as much as a month in your off time, you can create templates, which is a joke if you know about what that normally takes. There's research that says that companies often take, the average in this one particular piece of research was 53 weeks, right? So some confusion in this book. I caution about some of those aspects. All right, cool. So all that context now, this is the overall thing this leads up to. This is the targeted Agile framework, and you can see it set up in phases. So there's this kind of discovery phase. If you're in like the safe, safe model, then this is sometimes called the epic phase, right? But I'm doing this overall set of things that are more strategic kinds of stuff. There's two pieces of this, right? Out in front, I would like to get a cross-channel strategy so that what I'm creating fits into larger things, and innovation, of course, is part of what leads to this as well. then right before I start with Sprint Zero, I want to have this architectural work, right? So user interface structure, pet strategy. This gives me that blueprint for what I'm creating. Then, and I should note, right, this is in green because this is the central UX team that's usually doing this. And then they're going to hand that off to the people who are on that sprint team. And those people, you're going to have one or maybe two people who are going to be reviewing the work that they did, basically creating the MVP. What we start off with is this MVE idea. If you guys are curious, we could talk more about that. You can ask questions, but it's just creating this vision of what's going on for the user in a minimal way, and a way that's a bit broader than just like what'll stand on its own and not blow up. And then we use that in order to create and prioritize the MVP stuff and keep track of what the user stories are going to be and prioritize those. And that release plan comes out of that. Then we get into sprint 1 and onwards. And here, as I said, usually we want to be sprint ahead if possible, but you can also, this also works for concurrent if that is the case. But you see the overall flow. So we start off with sprint planning, which is, it's done with the whole team, but the UX Agile staff are the ones who are mostly focused on that, right? Screen flows are definitely UX Agile staff, the UX staff. And then this collaborative screen design thing, we really need to be working with the developers to have their input. They're not sitting with us the whole time, but we're making sure that we're creating stuff that they can, that uses their understanding and is stuff that they can relatively easily create. It's not unnecessarily complex, right? Then we're going to do a usability test of that design. This is that one-day usability test. Ideally, this should really be done by the central UX team, not by the people who are the sprint team. And the reason for that is that we'd like to have an independent review of that. And then we're going to do a review of the designs by a central UX authority. This is in order to make sure that the designs are obeying standards. They're obeying the templates. Then we hand off to development. You can see this is collaborative where we're doing that handoff, and that goes to developers. And the development happens. Obviously, UX is not involved in creating the development aside from keeping an eye on it, which is going on in daily stand-ups, by the way. So all throughout, as development is working, UX should be sitting in on those daily stand-ups to keep track of progress. And then that ongoing debt backlog, keeping track of that as we discussed. So this is the overall thrust of how we do UX in a mature way in an agile system development lifecycle. And again, I want to emphasize all this stuff that goes on ahead of and outside of this to make it work. All right, so that's what I wanted to cover, and I'm going to hand this off to Krrish to share a little bit of his experience. Krrish, you can share your screen. Krrish, are you there?
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Share. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. I hope you can see my screen.
Yep.
Okay, cool. So I'd like to start with, so I've been in Agile for about, it's been about 7-8 years now, in different companies, different financial institutions, telecom, and we consult a lot, and in different companies and all. So we've seen different flavors of Agile now. Like Noah was mentioning, certain things are agile, certain things are fragile. So all of that. So we come across quite funny stuff at times, and we have to, kind of like make sure things work for the business and for the user as well. So I'd like to share a case study. One of the case studies from one of the financial institutions we were working. And this is basically a UK-based financial institution. We were part of the central UX team here, and a very matured, UX practice within the company exists here. And even then, I'm just going to share you, a case study where how things can actually go completely wrong. And so while we were working in the central UX team, we were completely unaware of one of the projects that actually kicked off within the company. And this was basically an existing asset management platform that the company wanted to revamp. And this was for, the big institutional clients. And so what really happened was, and this was the company's first Agile project. So they were, migrating from, and this is quite an old story, but they're actually migrating from, waterfall method, where all the teams were actually working in the traditional waterfall method, and they were trying to convert that into an agile, team. So they actually formed 3 teams, and they hired a consultant to kind of like guide them for, this whole, agile methodology, which the company was trying to adopt. And so initially 3 teams were actually formed, roughly around, I think, more than 50 people in total. And this actually included, and traditionally how agile teams work is that you have, developers, you have QA testers, product owners, the business analyst, and, the scrum master, also known as the iteration manager. And, of course, the VDs or visual design. Apart from them, the central business team, sales, legal, compliance, everybody is also involved. And this was all headed by the PMO, department. And while all of these different teams were actually involved, the central UX team was kept out of the loop completely. Now, in the discovery phase, as Noah mentioned, they actually, it's very important to actually include UX team. Now, we were actually completely out of, scope for the PMO. And essentially what happened was that they started with the discovery phase, and they even got into, the sprint 0 and sprint 1. So the agreement on, the overall platform, the requirements and everything was actually carried out by the BAs. Along with the business heads. And the BA wrote the user stories, the epics, with all the technical details. So quite a matured, working environment. And all the technical details were there. The project timelines were also considered, that, this much time will actually be taken for the entire sprints to actually finish off. The project started, and timelines were also communicated to the marketing team. So the budget was allocated for the marketing and, the collaterals and everything, and going into the newspaper and stuff. So let me just share with you what really happened after that. So this is what happened. So sprint 1, okay. So remember, the discovery phase is out. Now sprint 1, they, bring in the MVP solution. Now remember, this solution is purely between the BAs and the technical. So, and all of these different people are actually involved. But being a very matured UX practice, there was kind of a, way out for them, because the central UX team had to be involved for all kind of, validations if there was a digital product and anything that actually goes out of the company. So, and funny enough, when it actually came to us, we did the user testing, and with the 3 pilot clients that we actually got permission to do it with. And these were the results. Some said, they're completely confused. They don't really know, whether they're logged in, non-logged in. What is it that, the platform is supposed to do now? So they were completely confused, and some even said that, and 2 of them actually said, I would rather use the old platform because it actually gives me the relevant features rather than using this particular one, which, I don't really, am not really familiar with. Now, remember, in a financial institution, the institutional clients are really big money. So you can't just leave, even one of the, clients, unhappy. And funny enough, by sprint 2, and this was entire, everything was actually going into production environment, but obviously on a, separate URL and everything. So nothing was going directly to the public, but this was just for us to do a pilot. By sprint 3, we actually had the web analytics, and this was the result. So approximately like 20 to 23% of higher drop-off rate, and they were actually, releasing these features to more clients than just the 3 pilot clients. So the emailers were actually going out, and we were just monitoring the web analytics. Now, incidentally, thankfully, we were also, the UX team also had access to the web analytics completely. So they used to monitor it day in and day out. And we used to make, monthly reports of, what's going wrong, what's not working, what's working, and all those kind of things. So by sprint 3, we were also looking at, the error logs and incident reports. And there was also an increase in customer calls. So this came in from one of the, customer heads, and the customer care team actually, informed that, they're actually receiving more and more calls for the new platform, which they were completely unaware of, because this was supposed to be just a pilot. But remember, since this was going to the live clients, they were actually calling up the call center, and they had absolutely zero idea. So all of this actually happened. So and this was like 3 months when the sprint, nearly 1.5, 2 months to 3 months, when the sprints actually started. So overall, around 4 months had actually been lost. So all of the resources, 50 plus resources, the time and energy and everything actually into planning and everything. And at the end, what they actually had to do was simply to, put everything on hold. And this is what really happened. So they had to stop everything. And we actually went back to the drawing board with, the central UX team then was supposed to loan, one UX team member into each of the 3 teams. And this is what the team composition then looked like. So everything remains exactly the same, except that there's addition of one more team member, within each of the teams. And what really happened after this was, it was quite easy for us to actually, just get in. We took about 1.5 months to actually finalize on, most of the requirements and everything. We did stakeholder interviews. We, like Noah said, we have, a mature UX practice. So we did the environmental research. We did, and which was comparatively quicker for us because we knew the, kind of scenario we were actually dealing with and the clients. So all of the research was actually done, and then we got into the discovery. So this is how what we actually did as a central UX team. So prior to discovery, we actually should ideally, and this is something that Noah has already covered in his slides. But ideally, prior to discovery, if they had actually done proper business requirements, along with the UX team, rather than just sending the BAs, things would have been very easy. So the need analysis, research, all that is supposed to be done before the sprint 0 and before the discovery. During the discovery and inception, ideally where we work usually, the UX team usually drives the conversation rather than, the technical leads or the, BAs. And we set and agree on a relevant feature with all the stakeholders. And of course, the priority of development. So the priority of development is also based on not just the technical feasibility, but based on, what the user is actually, requiring and marrying it up with, the business requirements and the sales team, whatever brings in more money. Because at the end of the day, we are working, for the clients. So obviously we have to look at that as well. And of course, then in sprint 0, then we start translating those business requirements into epics and high-level user journeys. So this is not just the work of the BAs, but essentially it's a shared responsibility between the BAs and the UX as well. So that's a very important thing to do, because otherwise you'll actually land up in where we were earlier, and we had to actually scrap the whole project. So thankfully it was just 4 months. And we had to then increase the time, the business had to actually increase and agree on increasing the timelines. But there were some features which we, actually fell off because we had to kind of like, push those away and put it into the maintenance part, which, costed the business, somehow. But that was something that was supposed to be, it was imperative to actually do. So yeah. And, but overall, this is what really happened. And this is the importance of UX, in the discovery phase itself, rather than, pulling it up in, sprint 1, sprint 2. It's not just a plug and play. That's a very important thing we actually advocate to our clients, because the moment you think about UX as a plug and play, or think about UX as just a screen design, it's much more than screen design. And most of the clients that we actually meet, where mature UX practices present, they understand, the importance of UX. But where we go in for the first time, or where, it's like mid-sized companies where, UX is not consider to be that important. Sometimes, we look at these things that people are just looking at the screens and not really at the users, end. And yeah, I'm just gonna check on. So that's the case study I wanted to share with you. I hope this was insightful and helpful for all of you.
Awesome. All right, so let's see. If you want to stop sharing, we can do answering questions. If anyone wasn't on earlier, in the panel here, you'll see a thing that's the participants panel, and so you can raise your hand. I'll share it, just show that. So you'll see if you click participants down here at the bottom, then the panel will open up, and you can click. There's a raise hand button here at the bottom right, and if you do that, then I can bring you into the session, and you can ask any questions. If you like, you can ask questions in other places too. I see there was one from earlier on about the Basecamp model / expedition journey, which I'm a little less familiar with myself. That's a great case where having more of a conversation could help. Krrish, have you seen that Basecamp model, expedition journey model thing much?
No, I'm not familiar with that. Suresh, would you like to, kind of like explain what you're actually, you want to ask specifically, or give us more insights on what you're looking for?
See. Here, I'm putting him in a session so we can ask.
Yeah.
Hopefully that works. Suresh, if you'd like to go off mute, and if you have video, and if you don't mind, then we can see you too. I hope you're still there. I know it's not always possible for the technology to work, and you didn't offer to do this, but go by audio. I'm seeing him starting to try to turn on video, although I'm not seeing him yet, and I'm seeing him still on mute. Suresh, I think I'm not hearing you yet.
Okay.
Yep. Hey, Krrish, am I audible now?
Yeah, I hear you.
Am I audible? Oh, awesome. It was inspirational. Both of you guys hearing here, it's absolutely sync with the real practice what we are going through. I think indirectly or directly, you both guys have answered what the challenges I've gone through. It's about accurately the challenges we were going through, that the positioning the product designer in Scrum Agile teams. That's what I was asking about, since we're going with the 1 to 5 of the Basecamp model.
Yeah.
And where you nailed it with the slide, which is there are things that we really have to do out of the Agile, and there are things we really have to care about within the Agile. I think that answers me some of those Basecamp models. The most of the guys in practitioners talking about the Basecamp 3. And what are the things we would be handling in the Basecamp 5, and when we go through the transition in the expedition journey at the Basecamp 1. In those sort of things, we can that highlight about things. Thank you very much for the guys. What are the inputs you get doing? It was insightful and thought-provoking. And I was really pointing towards that. This was a challenge for us in our day-to-day activities, that the product designers will really have to be very adaptive. But then, when these Agile and Scrum teams come up with, hey, we are in the Basecamp 1, and what sort of, the deliverables from you as a UX practitioner are those sort of the questions. I'm really drilling down with, the able to relate with, what are the slides, some of the case studies which Krrish thrown, and the one with the slide which you really nailed it about, the things we really have to worry about out of Agile and within the Agile. So I think I can relate and build on that. Thank you very much, guys.
Thanks.
Awesome.
Right. Thanks for sharing a little more of that detail. I'm glad we spoke to that. That's what I was saying at the start.
I was a little worried about my internet bandwidth here. I'm sure I've not seen that. Thank you very much for the guys.
All right. Thank you. All right. Let's see. Other questions here. I'll go ahead and let me see if I can get this working. Oh, it's already moved him out of it? Okay, that's cool. We still have a little time. And, oh, I'm seeing a question in direct chat to me. And okay, so this question is asking about This question is asking about actually this thing with the MVE thing. So this is minimum viable experience is what that's talking about. Krrish, do you want to talk about that a little bit, or should I? I mean, if you'd like to.
Okay. So MVP traditionally, what really happens is that like I showed you what really happened with one of my case studies. MVP is something that is being driven by the BAs and the technical leads. Now, how the technical leads usually and I'm just going into a little technical detail. So how the agile features and all those prioritization actually happens, and the if you're familiar with the with the sizing of the features and all those kind of things. So what really happens is that people, the technical staff usually looks at what is something that they can actually just push out as a product and as features. Essentially, is that even important? Or the most important thing for the user? That's the main thing. I mean, so imagine it as okay. Let me share an example. So one of the one of our clients, and this is quite recent actually. So they said, in MVP one, sorry, this was MVP 3. So they were trying to push 3 different features. And they said, and how the sizing actually happens of the stories is that they actually, break it into one feature into even smaller components. So those smaller components were actually the MVP, forming one MVP. And it was actually making no sense because it wasn't making a full journey for the customer at all. Now, the MVE essentially, ties up at least one single user journey. So that's more important. And the MVP essentially is just a fragment of, some of the features that were actually being, pushed out. So we couldn't even test, user test, one feature because it was half-baked kind of a feature, and it made absolutely no sense. And, the other parts of that particular, user journey, which was kind of like completing that user journey, but it was, smaller features, was being done in, sprint 5, sprint 6, and all of that. So, MVP, should ideally be derived from the MVE, which is, more about the actual experience and those kind of things. So that's more important. So that's what, MVE and MVP is. I hope I'm making any sense, or are there any questions around it or confusion? I've tried to, get into a bit technical. So which is why I'm asking this question. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not seeing any questions.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we are at the hour, so so last chance if anyone has any other questions. But I'm so glad to share all of this with all of you, and I hope it's useful. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Hey Krrish, hey Nahan, thanks for your time. Is there any other channel where we get in touch with in future? Like I'm also part of a CUA. I'm active follower with the HFI, and I'm the follower of Eric Schaffer as well. I don't have to mention here. That's about, of course. And is there any other channel? Is there the HFI Connect is not so active these days, or is there any other channel to get touch base with you guys, so that we can exchange more thoughts and appreciate?
Yeah, there's the CUA Central group we have on Facebook, so that's a good place to keep track of us. I do suggest subscribing to us on YouTube. We have some videos coming out there, and it's a mix of different stuff. Some of it's more entertaining, and some of it's more kind of just like interesting stuff coming out of some of our offices. But some content. We have some newsletters. We're not too aggressive with those, but we have a few of those too. Krrish, other stuff that I'm not thinking of?
No, I think I think that's about it. Actually, the marketing material does cover. We do send out some emailers on the upcoming webinars and those things. But yeah, Facebook seems to be the perfect place because that's like being updated and kept track of.
Yeah. Oh, we do have a Twitter account also, so we're there as well.
Awesome. Sure. Thanks.
Beautiful. All right. Thanks again. All right. Let me go ahead and close out the session now.